Reflections in the Dark. A Friday the 13th experience from lurking moonlight. In my profession, I encounter individuals from across the globe. Working in an area surrounded by colleges means finding temporary help is rarely a challenge. Students eagerly claim evening shifts that accommodate their academic schedules, making the late swing and graveyard shifts surprisingly competitive. Night work carries its own peculiar ambiance. I've always appreciated the eerie stillness that settles after dark. The rhythmic hum of machinery, the inconsistent flicker of fluorescent lights, the mournful whistle of wind against the window panes. They orchestrate a perfect symphony for the macabre. Conversations inevitably drift toward the uncanny and unexplained during these hours. Ghostly encounters serve as the gateway, soon branching into discussions of cryptids, unexplained phenomena, and cosmic horrors. My first submission actually emerged from one such late-night exchange, a story shared by a longtime colleague, whose experience I'll relate here, changing only names to protect their identity. That particular evening, we were discussing Friday the 13th, its origins, superstitions, and the psychological weight of its reputation. It was during this conversation that Trevor decided to share his own Friday the 13th encounter. His story wasn't what any of us expected. Trevor had a mesmerizing way of speaking that commanded attention. As he began, the ambient sounds of our workplace seemed to recede into a distant hum. I'll share his experience in his own words. When I was in high school, my friends and I treated Friday the 13th with reverence. Those nights were sacred. We'd venture deep into the woods, build a fire, and exchange tales of terror until someone inevitably surrendered to fear and begged to leave. But fate had other plans for me that particular Friday. I was scheduled to work. Back then, I bussed tables at a local restaurant. Nothing glamorous, but it financed my teenage necessities. I couldn't help feeling a pang of jealousy, knowing my friends would be performing our ritual without me. That night's shift stretched until 2 a.m. As customers gradually disappeared, I methodically cleared tables and sanitized surfaces. By closing time, only Sean the cook and I remained. We typically worked closing shifts together on weekends. Sean was in his mid-20s, close enough to my age that we shared an easy camaraderie. He carried himself with a relaxed demeanor that concealed an underlying mischief, like he perpetually balanced on the edge of some hidden knowledge or private joke. After finishing our closing duties, we sat in a darkened booth, awaiting his girlfriend's arrival. She worked late at a bar across town, and wouldn't appear until 3 a.m. I offered to drive him home, but he declined with a knowing smile, explaining she'd be displeased if he wasn't waiting when she arrived. As we waited, Sean inquired about my weekend plans. I expressed my disappointment about missing our Friday the 13th tradition. The foreboding atmosphere of the forest, the ritualistic storytelling, the intoxicating rush of collective fear. Something shifted in his expression then. "I can show you something," he said, leaning forward with sudden intensity. "But you'll need true courage and absolute discretion. This stays between us. No one else who works here can know." His words carried a weight that both unsettled and intrigued me. "What are you talking about?" I asked, attempting to mask my curiosity with nonchalance. "Just follow me," he replied. "We have time." I trailed behind him through the restaurant's back corridors, through the kitchen, and into a storage area, where he retrieved 2 birthday candles from a shelf. We continued to the party room, a space reserved for celebrations that sat perpetually empty during late hours. At its far end stood a seldom-used bathroom. Once inside, Sean produced a lighter, ignited the candles, and positioned them on either side of the mirror, above the sink. The dancing flames cast distorted shadows across the confined space, transforming familiar contours into something ancient and unrecognizable. "Kill the lights," he instructed. I hesitated momentarily, before complying. Darkness engulfed us, broken only by the pale yellow glow of candlelight. "Now comes the test of courage," Sean said, removing his name badge. He extended it toward me with an expectant gaze that left no room for refusal. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice betraying my mounting apprehension. He offered no immediate response. Instead, he used the pin on his badge to pierce his fingertip, drawing forth a crimson bead. With methodical precision, he began inscribing arcane symbols across the upper portion of the mirror. As he worked, he finally spoke, "Draw whatever shapes materialize in your mind. Choose the first number that surfaces in your thoughts." I faltered, but something in his practiced movements suggested he'd performed this ritual before. I removed my own badge and followed his example, wincing as the pin broke skin. I began tracing patterns across the mirror's lower half, guided by impulses I couldn't identify. My heart thundered against my ribs, yet something compelled me forward. When I finished, Sean stepped back to contemplate our creation. His expression remained unreadable in the wavering light. "What happens now?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. His earlier mischievousness had vanished completely. "Now we wait." I examined my handiwork at the mirror's bottom, fingertips smeared with blood. Sean nodded gravely. "Close your eyes. Empty your mind completely, for approximately 1 minute. Think of absolutely nothing." I closed my eyes, but achieving mental emptiness proved impossible. The flickering light penetrating my eyelids, and the subtle scent of melting wax anchored me firmly to reality. Just as I prepared to abandon the effort, I heard Sean exhale deeply. Taking this as my cue, I opened my eyes. The mirror had transformed, not just coated with conventional condensation, but permeated by something more fundamental, as if the mist existed beneath our blood markings, within the glass itself. "What now?" I whispered. No response came. Sean stood motionless, transfixed by the mirror, eyes vacant. Following his gaze, I noticed the anomaly. The mist wasn't static, it undulated slowly, like smoke suspended in gelatin. Then, faintly at first, I detected it, a groaning emanating from the pipes within the walls. The noise intensified, evolving into rhythmic pounding. My eyes darted to Sean, but he remained entranced, features blank, gaze locked on the mirror. My stomach plummeted. Returning my attention to the glass, I saw them. Faces materialized in the fog, indistinct and ephemeral, drifting through the mist, like swimmers beneath ice. I tried convincing myself it was merely an illusion created by light and shadow. Then came another sound, a whisper emerging from the faucet, a strained, rasping voice that raised every hair on my body. The words were indecipherable, but their wrongness was unmistakable, as if spoken by something that had never possessed a human throat. I wanted to flee, but my body refused to obey. My eyes remained imprisoned by the mirror, as the faces gained definition. Hollow eyes and twisted mouths emerged from the vapor. One visage lingered longer than its companions. Its features appeared sharper, more deliberate, and its gaze fixed directly upon me. My legs felt leaden, but I managed to reach over and tug at Sean's pant leg. He showed no reaction, remaining locked in his trance-like state, eyes trained on the mirror, as if hypnotized by some invisible force. "Sean," I whispered desperately. "Nothing." I swallowed hard and forced myself to shout, "Sean." The sound shattered the stillness. He stumbled from his daze, disoriented. His eyes flicked toward the candles, and without hesitation, he swept them into the sink, extinguishing their flames. Darkness consumed us. "Let's go," I managed, voice trembling. I reached for the doorknob, but as my fingers closed around it, violent pounding erupted from the opposite side, rattling both wood and metal beneath my touch. "Don't," Sean hissed urgently. "Don't open the door." I froze. The knocking persisted, growing louder and more chaotic, no longer confined to the door, but emanating from every surface, walls, stalls, ceiling. The entire space seemed to awaken with malevolent intent. "Forget it," Sean shouted. I wrenched the door open and stumbled into the party room. Darkness prevailed here too,
save for the anemic glow of parking lot lights filtering through distant windows. That's when I saw them. Dozens of shadows slithered across walls and floor, autonomous, purposeful. They weren't projections of physical objects. They were entities unto themselves. Sean screamed for me to run and shoved me forward. We bolted through the party room, kitchen, and main dining area, not stopping until we reached the restaurant's entrance, where streetlights spilled through glass doors. We stood panting, hearts racing. For a moment, silence reigned. The occasional passing car created waves of light that washed over us. As I prepared to speak, headlights cut through the darkness. They swept across the parking lot as Sean's girlfriend pulled up to the entrance. Sean gripped my arm with surprising strength. "We never speak of this," he commanded. "To anyone." I nodded, but as I glanced back toward the darkened party room, I couldn't silence the question echoing through my mind. Had we truly escaped whatever we'd awakened? As we exited, Sean secured the door. I waited briefly before he waved goodbye and joined his ride. I hurried to my car with purposeful strides and departed. My next shift came the following evening. I clocked in at the register and headed toward the back when the outgoing busboy intercepted me. "Hey," he remarked casually. "I cleaned up a mess in the party room, bathroom earlier. Was someone scheduled to use it yesterday?" "No," I replied, throat suddenly dry. "Well, looks like some kids got creative back there. Had to use the biohazard kit." He gestured toward the empty spot where it normally hung. "Can you grab one of the replacements from storage? I forgot to restock it." He departed to clock out, leaving me frozen in place. I continued working there for several months, closing with Sean most weekends. We occasionally discussed that night in hushed tones, but never revisited that section of the restaurant after hours. I still don't understand what manifested that night, but I've learned that when you deliberately seek darkness, sometimes the darkness finds you first.
Something in the Sky from Electronia. I was working along the Virginia-West Virginia border. The only available accommodation near my work site was a decommissioned bar-restaurant perched atop a substantial mountain. The nearest town lay a 10-minute drive away, with no residences in either direction. The interior was cavernous and oddly fortified with reinforced doors that required a specialized locking mechanism. Despite the time of day, the absence of windows rendered the space perpetually midnight dark. My shifts ended at 7. After showering and eating, true night would have descended. One evening, I stepped outside to smoke, gazing skyward at the constellations that seemed unnervingly close from my elevated position. Around 11, I ventured out for a final cigarette before bed. Looking up again, I noticed something impossible. Hovering above me was an object roughly the length of 4 vehicles placed end to end. The shape maintained a light at each extremity. I briefly marveled at its presence, acutely aware that it floated so low that a well-aimed stone might have struck it. I rushed inside for my camera, but upon returning, the object had inexplicably relocated behind the building. Fear overwhelmed my curiosity. This was no celestial body. Stars don't traverse distances with such deliberate intent. I retreated indoors, securing the door behind me. Sleep evaded me as visions of otherworldly visitors occupied my thoughts. The following day, I shared my experience with colleagues. Locals merely nodded knowingly, explaining that unexplained phenomena regularly occurred in that area. Thankfully, I never witnessed it again, though I found myself avoiding the night sky until my assignment concluded, and I relocated. Clown on the highway from K. Pete, this isn't an elaborate tale, but it fundamentally altered my perception of safety. I worked late-night cleaning shifts at Kohl's, finishing around midnight. One particular evening, I began my half-hour journey home, along a desolate highway devoid of residential properties. Eventually, I noticed something occupying the center of the road ahead. Initially suspecting wildlife, I reduced my speed slightly. As distance decreased, I realized it was a human figure. I slowed considerably, confusion mounting, as I observed no vehicles nearby, and knew no homes existed in this vicinity. Approaching further revealed the person wore a clown costume, and was actively beckoning me. Uncertainty paralyzed me, and I stopped my vehicle in the middle of the highway. We engaged in silent observation of one another. The standoff broke when the figure suddenly produced a blade from behind his back. Shock temporarily disconnected me from reality. I momentarily forgot I sat within the protective shell of an automobile. As the figure advanced toward me, survival instincts reactivated. I accelerated sharply, narrowly avoiding collision. Upon reaching home, I contacted my employer and terminated my position. 3 weeks after my resignation, Grace, our loss prevention manager, disappeared from that same parking lot. Shortly thereafter, the establishment permanently closed. What haunts me most persistently is learning they discovered a crumpled note in her vehicle, bearing the same 3 words that had been left on mine. "I'm watching you." Demon attached to my boss's ex-wife from secondhand haunt at my first tattoo parlor job. My boss navigated a contentious divorce. Some background: he was a Native American man in his 40s, superstitious but not particularly spiritual. His wife struggled with substance dependency and infidelity, directing inexplicable hostility toward me, a 22-year-old female employee, constantly accusing him of improper motives in hiring women. One evening, 3 colleagues and I visited his home while his ex removed her possessions. We aimed to provide moral support through music, bringing guitars and drums for an impromptu session. Everyone remained completely sober. Conversation eventually turned toward his soon-to-be ex, whereupon the lights began to flicker. He confessed this occurred regularly whenever anyone mentioned her name inside the house. Skeptical yet curious, we tested his claim. Indeed, uttering her name caused the bedroom lights to fluctuate. He had thoroughly investigated the electrical system during pre-sale preparations, yet technicians found no abnormalities. We quickly changed subjects and continued our evening. Our boss had a young daughter who wasn't present, but maintained a baby monitor near the television. While starting a movie, the monitor activated. We heard a child's indistinct voice and initially dismissed it, but our boss tensed, stating, "I know every toy in that room." None produced that sound. A colleague and I accepted the challenge to investigate. We examined every toy meticulously, but couldn't replicate the voice we'd heard. The remainder of the night passed uneventfully. Days later, our boss arrived at work visibly exhausted. He recounted a vivid nightmare, featuring a 2-headed bird outside a church. People entered through the front doors while bodies were discarded from the rear. The bird spoke continuously about the King of Lies. My religious upbringing prompted me to recognize potential references to Belial, Lord of Lies. I suggested researching protective measures, including sage cleansing. He requested our assistance purifying the home. Upon arrival, we noticed his cat refused to enter the house, remaining firmly in the backyard. The interior atmosphere felt oppressive and unnaturally cold, though nothing overtly supernatural occurred during our cleansing ritual. After his ex completely vacated the property, the environment transformed noticeably. The cat resumed normal behavior, and our boss's nightmares ceased. We became convinced she carried an attachment that left residual energy requiring removal. The Man in the Parking Lot, from Ron Rard. This occurred in 2010. While I worked at a North Carolina Kmart. One mid-October morning, I arrived before sunrise. After parking, I gathered my belongings and exited my vehicle, immediately noticing an unusually intense flicker in one of the building's exterior lights. What truly captured my attention, however, was a figure standing nearby, presumably male, though facial features remained obscured. He wore an extended dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, concealing his identity. Most disturbing was my certainty that he'd been observing me since my arrival. Maintaining peripheral awareness of him, I entered the store to clock in and receive my daily assignments. Inside, I encountered 2 colleagues, Betty and Mark, who had just arrived. I inquired about the ominous individual outside, but they reported seeing no one. I dismissed the incident as possibly a transient passing through. While stalking the home goods section, a dark silhouette darted past my aisle. The sudden movement startled me backward. After composing myself, I cautiously investigated, but found nothing. Approximately an hour later, a distinct sensation of surveillance descended upon me. Finding no one in my immediate vicinity, I glanced toward the bath section and froze. The hat-wearing figure stood there, watching me intently. Feigning ignorance, I tidied my area and retreated to loss prevention. I explained the situation to Grace, our manager, who reviewed security feeds but found no evidence of this individual. Thoroughly unsettled, I requested supervision for the remainder of my shift. Grace obliged, patrolling nearby, but never locating the mysterious observer. When my shift concluded, I collected my belongings and proceeded to my vehicle. Upon arrival, I discovered a crumpled paper affixed to my windshield. Unfolding it, revealed 3 words: "I'm watching you." I scanned the area frantically, but saw nothing. I immediately contacted my supervisor, upon reaching home, resigning my position. 3 weeks later, Grace vanished from the store's parking lot. Shortly thereafter, the establishment permanently closed. What perpetually disturbs me is that investigators discovered a crumpled note bearing those same 3 words on her passenger seat. Scratches from Anonymous. Before sharing this account, I must emphasize its authenticity. This experience didn't happen to me personally, but to a close friend I'll call Mary, accompanied by her sister Kelly. Both were college-aged when this occurred during summer break. Here's Mary's story. We accepted a house-sitting job for an acquaintance, a psychiatrist traveling to Europe for slightly over a week. Our responsibilities included caring for her cat and maintaining the property. Kelly and I established a schedule. I would oversee daytime duties while she managed overnight stays. The first day proceeded uneventfully, but nights quickly proved different. One evening, as Kelly settled in the guest bedroom, she heard scratching and thumping noises emanating from the attic. The home's layout is relevant here: 3 stories, attic, main floor, and basement. The attic staircase adjoined the guest bedroom, meaning whatever occupied that space would necessarily pass her door to access other floors. Kelly attributed the disturbance to an animal seeking shelter, not uncommon in residential properties. Despite the noise, she eventually fell asleep. The following morning upon arrival, I found Kelly had prepared breakfast for both of us. As we ate, she described the previous night's strange sounds. I suggested it was likely wildlife seeking shelter, and urged caution, but reassured her it probably posed no serious threat. We completed our responsibilities, and Kelly departed to prepare for an evening event. Since she would return late, I agreed to cover the night shift instead. I prepared the guest room but, unlike Kelly, found sleep impossible once the noises began. I listened intently as something traversed the attic. Then I heard the attic door open. I swiftly secured the bedroom door and listened. A rapid succession of heavy footsteps descended the attic stairs. I retreated to the bed, silently praying as terror overwhelmed me. Eventually, exhaustion claimed me. Morning sunlight prompted rationalization. Perhaps I'd imagined the door opening. The footsteps could have been the cat, and the house's age explained various sounds. While eating breakfast, Kelly arrived and immediately inquired about scratches on my vehicle's paint. Confused, I explained I hadn't driven the previous night. "They're small but numerous," she noted. I promised to investigate after breakfast. I descended to retrieve laundered sheets, but discovered the dryer empty, the linens mysteriously absent. This deeply unsettled me, but I maintained a facade of normalcy. Later, examining the car scratches, I realized they were too extensive for typical animal damage. Returning inside, I approached Kelly with trepidation. "Can we stay together tonight?" I asked. "Of course, but why?" "The scratches." "All right," she agreed. "If anything else happens, we leave immediately, and don't return. As darkness fell, we sat nervously in the bedroom. The noises began precisely as before, initially confined to the attic. Then movement started. The ancient door creaked open. Floorboards protested beneath invisible weight. Squeak, squeak, squeak. We had already secured our door, but trembled as the footsteps approached. Silence descended. Even the cat remained perfectly still in the corner. Then the stillness shattered as our doorknob violently rattled, followed by scratching and pounding against the wood. Terror overwhelmed us, bringing involuntary tears. The assault suddenly ceased, and footsteps retreated. We huddled in the corner, hands covering each other's mouths to muffle our sobs, remaining frozen until morning light. Kelly cautiously opened the door at daybreak. Finding the coast clear, we rushed to the kitchen and contacted the homeowner. Upon hearing our description, she responded with alarming urgency. "Get out immediately." Kelly disconnected, and we sprinted toward her car. Alongside it, we noticed additional scratches now forming a sentence. "Get out." We needed no further encouragement. Speeding away, Kelly received another call from the psychiatrist. "Are you safely away?" "Yes." "Good. Call the authorities. One of my patients may be in the house." "What?" "I have a restraining order against a patient who's threatened me extensively. She's extremely dangerous, potentially psychotic." We followed her instructions. Later, after police secured the premises, they searched thoroughly. The main floor and basement yielded nothing, but the attic revealed a middle-aged woman who had created a nest from stolen household linens. Most disturbing was their discovery beneath her makeshift pillow, a 6-inch knife. Can we not? From Dante, my profession isn't universally appealing. I've witnessed people departing in vengeful fury, or gripped by such profound terror, that despite countless exposures, I cannot prevent dread from colonizing my own consciousness. I serve as a triage nurse on a military base near an active conflict zone, which legal restrictions prevent me from identifying. I've experienced combat personally, evidenced by the prominent scar traversing from my ear to nose, where shrapnel embedded itself. I regularly treat comparable or worse injuries. Our facility maintains constant activity, processing traumatic wounds that frequently prove fatal. We routinely send young service members home with identification between their teeth. Eventually, the atrocities of war, the remarkable suffering human bodies endure, becomes normalized, a psychological necessity for continued functioning. Recently, a patient arrived with multiple gunshot wounds to critical areas. Remarkably, no vital organs sustained punctures. Despite significant blood loss, he displayed surprising stability after treatment. His name was Alan. Alan served as a sniper and had been compromised in enemy territory, likely through betrayal, since his position had been secured beyond enemy sight lines, and employed signal dampening technology. He barely returned to base before being transported to our facility, in critical condition. I learned this represented his first unsuccessful mission, affecting him profoundly. His resilience fascinated me, losing substantial blood, yet maintaining exceptional vitality and combativeness toward staff, attempting to mobilize him post-surgery. His unique response broke through my professional detachment, prompting me to visit during quiet periods. We discussed various topics: home, occupation, life experiences, animals, companions, memories, relationships. His perspective captivated me. Despite nearly perishing on my table, he exuded calm purposefulness, expressing envy toward those still deployed. His yearning for combat seemed motivated by protective instinct toward his unit, rather than aggression. He consistently inquired about returning to duty, declining opportunities to return stateside. "My place is with my brothers, ensuring their safety," he explained. His team had nicknamed him Guardian for his protective capabilities. He recounted their shared experiences with evident affection. By yesterday, medical clearance arrived.
He had recovered admirably. As I encouraged him to avoid returning under similar circumstances, he shared something profoundly disturbing. During the firefight, where he sustained injuries, he observed something inexplicable within enemy lines, an entity he repeatedly targeted, without effect. He described a creature seemingly tethered to an enemy soldier, possessing hollow white eyes and unnatural joint configuration. Its face appeared partially devoured, skin fractured and contorted with each movement. No one else perceived this entity, yet Alan heard it producing sounds, human voices trapped in corrupted repetitive loops, each iteration deteriorating further into incomprehensible noise. The volume overwhelmed even gunfire. Paralyzed by this apparition, he remained fixated on the soldier, whose eyes reflected primal terror, despite apparent sedation. His escape mechanism remains unclear. Perhaps adrenaline or instinctual fear propelled him to the nearest camp. Upon reporting his experience, medical personnel attributed his account to blood loss delirium. I still question whether he encountered something supernatural or experienced hallucinations from extreme physiological stress. Some visions, once witnessed, permanently alter perception of reality's boundaries.
Things that keep me awake from Oliver D. I-10 bar in rural South Louisiana. One December night, in 2021, I departed work around 3 a.m., thoroughly exhausted after hosting a company Christmas party. Construction had compromised the highway, so I opted for back roads to expedite my journey home. Several miles into my drive, while cycling through radio stations to maintain alertness, I noticed distant flashing taillights. Though I typically avoid stopping for stranded motorists, the extreme cold triggered compassion. Approaching the vehicle, an early 2000s model, with an open rear passenger door, I peered inside and discovered it empty. As I prepared to call out, something froze the words in my throat, bloodied handprints throughout the interior, and a substantial stain saturating the driver's seat. Panic rising, I reached for my phone to activate its flashlight, when an agonized scream pierced the silence. Originating from nearby woods, every instinct urged immediate retreat and police notification. Yet something prevented abandonment. Recalling my Smith & Wesson handgun in the console, I retrieved and chambered it before cautiously approaching the tree line. Following a blood trail from the vehicle, navigating dense underbrush, while adrenaline coursed through my system, produced an almost feverish sensation, despite the cold. Eventually reaching a clearing, I discovered a shovel protruding from the earth beside a sizable excavation. Approaching with mounting dread, I illuminated the pit. The sight proved nearly unbearable. A woman lay inside, clearly deceased, clothing saturated with blood. She wore a distinctive puffy blue winter coat. The brutality forced my gaze away. Composing myself, I surveyed my surroundings before frantically retreating toward the road. Upon emerging from the tree line, I discovered the abandoned vehicle had vanished. I immediately contacted authorities. Within minutes, emergency vehicles converged. A tall, thin officer with dark features approached to interview me. I agreed to guide him to the discovery site, but upon reaching the clearing, nothing resembled my recollection. Vegetation appeared thicker, the landscape altered. Most significantly, neither shovel nor excavation remained. No evidence suggested ground disturbance whatsoever. After retrieving my dropped weapon, I insisted the grave had existed precisely where we stood. Cognitive dissonance overwhelmed me as the officer escorted me back. Had extreme fatigue-induced hallucinations? Was my mental state deteriorating? The officer promised a comprehensive search team deployment, but recommended I seek rest. Meanwhile, after confirming my ability to drive safely, I departed. Sleep proved impossible that night, the woman's image perpetually resurfacing. A month passed without developments before police unexpectedly requested my presence for questioning. At the station, detectives presented photographs of a woman, asking if I recognized her. Though alive and smiling in the images, I immediately identified her as the deceased. I discovered the detectives exchanged disconcerted glances before delivering shocking information. This woman disappeared 15 years ago. They explained that canine units had alerted precisely where I'd indicated. Excavation revealed human remains, later identified as a cold case victim, who had vanished alongside her 5-year-old daughter. The only previous evidence had been their abandoned vehicle, with neither the child's remains nor the perpetrator ever located. Upon examining scene photographs, I observed remains wrapped in a deteriorated blue puffy jacket, identical to what I'd witnessed. While some suggest divine intervention bringing closure to the family, I remain haunted by fundamental questions. Why me? Why then? I avoid dwelling on this experience, but occasionally her face resurfaces in my thoughts, alongside questions about her missing child's fate. I can only hope they've found peace. Big box store burnout from Mad Note. No children were harmed in this account. During a post-work happy hour, reminiscing about former employment sparked a memory worth sharing. While not conventionally terrifying, it illustrates our responses when confronted with extraordinary circumstances. We imagine knowing our reactions to abnormal situations, but reality often proves otherwise. Few actually mobilize when truly needed. Late summer 2000, pregnant with my December due firstborn, I secured part-time employment to accumulate additional savings before maternity leave. My crafting interest led me to the arts and fabric department of a local superstore, working Friday and Saturday evenings from 6:10 p.m. My department occupied the far rear left corner, receiving minimal traffic, especially during Friday evenings. Its proximity to restrooms accommodated my frequent pregnancy-related needs, and seating availability relieved my perpetually swollen feet. One evening, my mother's familiar voice greeted me. "Hi, chickadee." "Hey," I responded tiredly, attempting to stand. She gestured for me to remain seated. "I'm just getting fabric for the baby's quilt. The one with Dalmatians and fire hydrants." My husband volunteered with the fire department, making this pattern particularly meaningful. After selecting thread and additional supplies, she brought the fabric for measuring and cutting. As she placed it on the table, we suddenly realized an unnatural silence had descended across the store. Confused, we exchanged glances. Then indistinct shouting erupted from the entrance, not coherent communication but deranged vocalization. Concerned yet curious, we cautiously approached. We discovered customers and staff frozen in silent tableau, staring toward the entrance with expressions of stunned disbelief. An unfamiliar odor reached me, which my mother immediately recognized with a horrified exclamation. Following her gaze, I understood her reaction. A man thrashed wildly, seemingly oblivious that his body was actively combusting. Charred flesh visibly separated from his limbs with each movement. Between desperate appeals for assistance, he explained his vehicle was ablaze with his children trapped inside. "Someone please help me," he repeated, with escalating desperation. His soot-blackened face was streaked with perspiration and tears, white-rimmed eyes, wide with primal terror. His partially incinerated shirt hung asymmetrically from his frame. It's peculiar how insignificant details register during catastrophic moments, as if time dilates and perception heightens, allowing observation of minutiae typically overlooked. My mind bizarrely recalled inappropriate song lyrics about fire, which I forcibly suppressed. We remained immobilized, witnessing this man's anguish, without response. He moved erratically, clearly in shock, focused exclusively on his children's predicament. It seemed we couldn't process the scene unfolding before us. I scanned the checkout area, expecting staff to contact emergency services. Didn't they receive crisis training? The paralysis seemed eternal, until someone finally shouted, "Call 911. A woman in medical attire was already rushing toward the exit, followed by 3 men accompanying the distraught father. Shortly thereafter,
Sirens penetrated the stillness. Gradually, the store's normal cadence resumed. Register beeping, conversation murmurs, activity resuming, as if nothing extraordinary had transpired. Noticing my distress, my manager suggested early departure. I collected my belongings and exited with my mother. In the parking lot stood the vehicle's blackened remains, being towed away. Only the engine compartment had burned completely, while the rear left passenger door had been forcibly removed. "I hope everyone survived," my mother whispered. A man seated nearby overheard. "I assisted them," he volunteered. "The children escaped unharmed, though frightened. The father sustained burns, but will recover. Ambulance transported the entire family."